got everybody? Who are we missing? John? Okay, I think we can get started, continue with this special meeting of the Bridge Street District. Marcia, do you want to give us the introduction and overview, please?
Yeah, as far as the agenda for this evening, the first item to review is the Bridge Street District Streetscapes Design Standards, and we started having this conversation at the April 7th workshop with City Council and presented to you at that time some information and some different materials that we were looking at with regard to curbs, the cycle track, sidewalks, and some of the lighting that we would be using in the Bridge Street District, and discuss the issue of signature streets and then the neighborhood or the network streets. So tonight, based upon the direction that we received at the April 7th meeting, for us to go back and do a review and analysis of the different options and bring back a recommendation to City Council. That's what we've done tonight. So we'll go over again and remind you where the different materials would be used and how they would be used, and then provide you with what our recommended option is and get your confirmation or your feedback on that, if you have any concerns or issues that you disagree with on that. Also to talk about, there were some questions about the cycle track and the placement and where is the best place for the placement of the cycle track. We've had follow-up conversations with representatives from the Bicycle Advisory Task Force, as well as other consultants that we've used in the past to get information on the cycle track and the placement of the cycle track. And also the street lighting, we're going to present to you what we would have as our recommendation. The timing on the street lighting is not quite as critical as the rest of the materials. We will be having a bid soon on the John Shields Parkway and plan to bring to City Council for the July 1st council meeting a resolution to award the contract on that project. So that's kind of the time frame that we need in order to have a decision on the materials that we'll be presenting this evening. The next item is to just start an introduction of the John Shields Parkway Greenway concept, so you can start seeing how that may look once it's laid out and it starts to develop, and also to go over some brief conversations that we've had with regard to how current potential developments may be impacted by the Greenway. And then also the development review process that we discussed, I think it was at the last council meeting, to bring back information to council for review of that. So with that, I'll turn it over to Darren to start in on the streetscape design standards to review what we've come up with since we've last met.
Very good. Darren?
Thank you, Mayor and council members, for the opportunity to present tonight. Give you an update, as Marcia said, on where we've been since our previous work session. As a quick reminder, the goal of this project is to create standards for the streets within the Bridge Street District. The timing of this is such that as individual projects come online, as we have a piece of street that's getting close to final design and construction, we want to make sure that decisions that are made with respect to the choices on that piece of street are part of a larger vision for the public realm. So we're working to create that larger vision and inform these individual projects. Bear with me here while I get one of these to work. There we go. Within the agenda tonight, there are a few items that we'll be asking for some specific feedback on, as Marcia mentioned, and I'll help identify what those are. And then there are some others that are just a general update that we want to make sure we're headed in the right direction with, but aren't as time sensitive. If you recall in our previous work sessions, one of the driving forces behind these decisions was to use materials that are authentic to Dublin. As we start to look at these streetscapes, we don't want this to look like the Nationwide Arena District or German Village. We want to have a look that's specific to the character of Dublin. And some of the things that we keyed in on in our previous work sessions are the different tools that are available to us to do that. So you can see here from a graphic, if you recall, we've got examples of art and architecture, pavements, landscape, All of these are tools that we have to use within the right-of-way in the public realm to help create the identity of the district for these streets. Another discussion we had is the idea of using durable materials as opposed to stamped asphalt or stamped concrete or some of those materials that pretend to be other materials. We're looking at options like brick and stone that weather very well and patina and age well and are very durable. In addition, as we started to look at those materials, we wanted to make sure that we understood fully what the cost is to install them day one. We want to understand how they're maintained and what the burden would be on the city in terms of making sure that these can be cared for, and also looking at the overall life cycle cost of these types of materials to see if there is a benefit to the city over the long run. And in addition to looking at some historic bid data from Central Ohio, we also looked at the example, the Arena District that we talked about, which was a very good example that's undergoing after 15 years its first renovations, and it has held up incredibly well over those first 15 years. So we're very carefully looking and making sure that we're looking ahead at the life cycle cost on these as well. And the last point I wanted to touch on from our previous conversations was the idea that we want to look at these streetscapes very comprehensively. And when you think of some of the more mundane pieces of the streetscape where you've got light poles or drains or pole boxes for electric, we want to look at every single aspect that you see visually within the street and make sure that it's folded into a comprehensive approach to the design of the street so that we have a very elegantly and exquisitely detailed streetscape. Okay, moving right into this. When we looked at the overall district, we had presented some maps previously, which we'll show again, that break the district down into 3 types of streets. And these 3 types of streets are guiding the decisions in terms of material recommendations and the level of finish of each of these streets. The first of these is what we're calling signature streets, which you can see in the dark blue or the dark gray here. These are your first impression of the district. They are the high volume, high visibility roadways to and through the district. So you see Bridge Street here to the south. This is the Scioto River here. Riverside Drive, High Street, Post Road coming in. These are the streets that we want to look very carefully at in terms of signature streets and the level of improvements that are made there so that we create a great first impression as you enter the district. The second type of street we've called district streets, which are in our lighter blue, and these are largely the interior streets. And the third type of street is in the historic core. I wanted to make a special mention here with the historic core. The boundaries that you see here would not change. I think we touched on this at a previous work session. As you see redevelopment happen within and around the historic core, there may be attributes architecturally that get extended out from that core, but we want to define that historic core as it exists and as historically it existed, and the character of that streetscape would really not bleed out beyond here. And part of the goal of having a distinct vision for the streetscape here, one, all of these relate. They're all part of a family of materials that relate to each other and identify the district. But part of, as we're planning the district, we want to make sure that the viability and the identity of the historic core is preserved. And looking at the streetscape is one of the tools we have at our disposal to help make sure that that always maintains a special place within the district and within the city. This is a very small portion of John Shields Parkway, what we're called phase 1 in this graphic. It's about 300 or so feet of roadway that's going to be the first piece built under these standards. And this little piece is what's driving a lot of the timelines for the decisions that we're looking at tonight. As we start to go through some of these are the decision points that we're going to be looking at together and wanting to get your specific feedback on paving materials for the street curbs, and the sidewalk paving materials. I've got some handouts that I'm going to pass around here. And what you'll see on each of the handouts are a couple images of materials, and then there is an orange number that identifies each of those materials across the top. And that orange number is going to correspond to 2 things. It's going to correspond to some of the renderings that we're looking at up on the screen, and it also corresponds to the physical samples that you see in front of you there. And part of the reason we're doing this is that we have attempted to do our best computer rendering of the colors and appearance of these materials but the quality of the projection, the quality of the computer is not always as accurate as seeing them in person. So you can kind of work back and forth between what you're showing you on the screen and what you're seeing there in front of you, and we'll take a few moments later if we want to stand up and look at those more closely. So we have 3 different street types that we've identified, and the signature street is the first of those. And the first thing that I want to point out is something that we're really not going to talk about tonight, but it's the architecture in the background. The architecture does not reflect any current developer's plans. What it is a placeholder that we've put in to help give you a comprehensive feel for how the buildings address the right-of-way. In order to evaluate what we're showing you in terms of the materials that we're proposing within the street, it's helpful to have an edge or a backdrop to evaluate that against. So there may be things that you dislike or like about the architecture, but it's really doesn't reflect anything other than our goal of giving a visual backdrop for these recommendations. Again, these are the orange numbers that correspond to your sheet, so let me walk you quickly through what we're proposing on the signature streets. The signature street, well, all of the streets, we're looking at the option of using a permeable paver in the street parking bay here, and that has a couple functions. It has an aesthetic function. Obviously, there's a parking, and how intuitive the parking is, but this is also an important stormwater management function as well. The permeable paver allows us to treat the stormwater quality treatment within the district, and it's part of the overall system of materials that relates within here.
Can I just interrupt?
Yes, please.
A quick question, and this is minutia perhaps, but I see between the roadway, it looks like there's a walking path, but the grassy area that's there, yeah, and apparently there's going to be a lot of that. Who takes care of that? Is that the property owner out front? Is that a city function? I mean, it's all part of the streetscape. Who's got to deal with that? Because those are small pieces.
I think some of that becomes what's negotiated as part of the projects here. There's going to be levels of enhancement in terms of, give the Casto example that came the other night. They may want to do more in that bed than the city would do for maintenance purposes. So I think some of those things will have levels of negotiation to it. But generally, this is city right-of-way stuff. What you're seeing there, I think, is largely the tree and then a plant material where there would typically be grass. Probably not stuff that's going to require the regular mowing, but would require some level of care. And all of those strips are kind of left open as opposed to being graded.
We don't need to belabor it. I just wanted to point it out. Thank you.
So what you're seeing here, again, this is the street material within the signature streets would be asphalt. And then we have a clay brick paver, permeable paver in here. And the border between those two, where you see the number 2 here, is granite curb. Just by way of a brief explanation, the reason you see multiple number 2s on here is because we're proposing to use the same material in different ways. So for example, you have a flush piece of granite here, you have your typical street curb, which is the same granite material, and then that's repeated again in these planter curbs here. We're looking at a clay brick sidewalk, which is the blend of the warmer red that you see there. It's not a bright fire engine red. But it's a nice muted color which transitions nicely to the darker brick that you see here in the street. Again, Mayor, the open planters here, which are best ideally for street tree growth, and we want to get as much good street tree cover as we can within the district. And you can also start to see some of the ways that we're approaching the detailing here with the street lighting, and you'll see some other examples where we want to incorporate those very carefully into the hardscape detailing that we're proposing. Are there any questions before I move on to the other streets about this type of graphic and the materials that you're seeing in front of you and on the handout? Is it clear what is what? I don't want to get too deep into this before we.
The materials are clear to me. The brick 3 there, that's not the sidewalk, but
Out here?
closer to, yeah, is that the cycle track?
That's the carriage path. So the street parking here, we have a little space to open your door so you can step out without putting your foot into the flower bed. So it's about a 3-foot wide space, that then you'd go to one of these pass-throughs to access the sidewalk.
Okay.
So there's no cycle track shown in this view.
So where are the bikes going to go? Just in the street?
They'll go on the cycle track or the bike path, and we'll show you where those are. There's some examples.
That's not pictured here, though. Gotcha.
Correct, yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions before I move on? The second type of street is the district street, which again is the internal street. And this is really a subset of what we just saw. So the signature streets have a level of finish that includes brick sidewalks, granite planter curbs. In the district street, we would still look at having the same detail for the street parking bay. You can see the flush granite curb, the asphalt street, the granite curb here. When you get behind the curb, we're looking at transitioning to a typical concrete sidewalk for these district streets. And again, you still have the open tree planters here. So in the previous slide, this was brick behind the curb, and the district streets, this transitions to concrete. And then with the historic core streets, this again is in historic Dublin, and there's a great opportunity there. I mentioned before maintaining the viability of the historic core and maintaining its identity. We think there's a great opportunity there to explore the idea of paving the streets in brick. All the examples that we've previously seen of the two other street types assume asphalt paving in the street, and then you transition to different materials in the street parking and sidewalk. The historic core, I think, could really benefit from the traffic calming effects, the aesthetic effects, the warmth, the identity that you would get from having a brick paving in the street. It's not a decision that needs to be made tonight. It's something for consideration. We've shown in a couple of illustrations here and want to get your thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, I'd like to hear a little bit from Megan about that at another time, but because I know she probably has some ideas from her past plowing snow on brick streets.
So this shows an example of an historic core street. So what you see in the sidewalk, number 4, is the lightest brick nearest the mayor on the table there, and that is your existing standard brick for the sidewalks in the historic core. What we're showing is taking the granite curb that's proposed. So really the granite curb, and this is based on our previous input from our presentations, would be continuous throughout the district. That is one of the main identifying elements throughout all the types of streets in the district. So again, you see that granite curb proposed here, and this gives you a sense of the brick that would be potentially out in the street. We'd also like to look at the idea of continuing some open planters here. We're very aware that the conditions within the historic core vary quite a bit with the historic buildings, the width of the right-of-way, grade changes. So there are a lot of latent conditions that we'd have to work with in order to apply this. But in areas where real estate permits, we'd like to look at the opportunity for bringing some of this greening into portions of the sidewalk. The other thing I want to mention in this view, we are coordinating with a wayfinding consultant as we start to look at this streetscape in its entirety. As any piece of street gets built, you start to see speed limit signs and no parking signs and street signs and all the type of signs that you might expect there. In addition to wayfinding and other district-related signs. So we're working closely to make sure that the architecture of these and how they relate to the street and how they hit the ground is being thought through very carefully with respect to influencing these initial projects that are about to get built. We did mention in our previous meeting that in addition to what we're recommending, we were going to explore some other alternatives, which primarily had to do with the different colors of the pavement. From a material standpoint, if you recall, brick and granite are two of the most durable and widely accepted streetscape alternative materials there, which we think are perfectly appropriate. But there's a lot of different colors and textures and varieties within those. So we had explored several different versions of this. In the lower right hand, this is sort of a key view to show you where the enlargements are up on top. So you see a signature street here, and the typical signature street here happens to be along John Shields. You can see the green. In this intersection here, we looked at a couple different alternatives. The brick that we're proposing in the street is very nearly black, which you see on the table there. It's for a couple reasons. One, is distinctive. Two, it will wear well in terms of hiding tire tracks and other things that you might see on a lighter material. And as importantly, it provides the contrast that we need for a safe and operational street. So in lieu of the striping at the intersections where you typically have the reflective white thermoplastic paint, we're looking at having the dark clay brick next to the light granite. So if you look at the head of the table here, I'll try not to hit anyone with this, that is the material combination that you're seeing right here, the very dark clay versus the lighter granite. So you achieve that contrast there. Then when we transition from the street into the walk, we wanted to look at a lighter and warmer brick for the walk, one of which you see up here was some cool grays that was quite a contrast with that. Here's an example that's much closer to what we're showing, but still a little bit of contrast between a warmer brick and the black. And this shows a very dark blend that is continuous along here where there's really no transition at all between the bricks. At the risk of confusing things, this is just to illustrate some of the alternatives that we explored with this. The recommendations are in front of you and on the previous illustrations, but these are some of the different avenues that we looked at and worked through carefully with staff and got their recommendations as well. So I'm going to sort of open it up for some comments here. Again, we have 3 street types: the signature streets in dark gray, the lighter blue district streets in the interior, the historic core here that you see in orange, and the first piece that's going to be built is a signature street. So most important to us tonight is, one, some general feedback on all of this, but specifically the signature street. And so I brought that image back up here and thought I'd sort of open it up with respect to the physical samples here, the image up on the screen, what you have in front of you, and get some comments and feedback on where this is headed. This specifically is the action that we'd like to get some feedback from council on tonight.
The separate car park striping, is that a brick inlay, or is that going to be an applied thermal?
If we mark the striping in those spots, it would be a brick inlay
Okay.
and not paint.
All right, thank you.
I like it.
Well done.
As do I.
Me too.
I have other comment besides I like it a lot. The only thing that I would question is in the historic district, the grass and, that you're talking about, grass and trees, how does that relate to the, I call them, those big planters we have right now? So are you talking about the removing of those and putting grass in?
That would be one alternative. When staff looked at these recommendations, there are some very good points brought up about the fact that those planters serve an aesthetic purpose, but they also help protect pedestrians from traffic.
Yes.
So I think we want to look through carefully on streets where that's an issue and see if, if we need to stick with the raised planters, if the planter we have is what we want to stick with, if there's an alternative to that meets the practical purpose of those raised planters, and on some of the smaller streets where there may not be that traffic concern like we have on Bridge Street, whether this would be appropriate.
Because I would say that, yes, they need to be left for the reasons that you stated, but also for a reason that's more practical in terms of cleaning up. I think it's much more difficult to ensure that the grass gets mowed on a regular basis, that trash doesn't accumulate in grass. And I think that the way right now, I don't know what the plan is about, but it's always picked up. Mm-hmm. And I think it's easier to have it picked up based on the brick and the way it's currently designed. Mm-hmm. And I do think that people have a sense when they're walking that there's an alleged protection for them, mm-hmm. that you would really feel, because it's not that wide mm-hmm. of a sidewalk, and that you would feel much more vulnerable.
I have a question about transitioning as you are coming in from the west, from 270 and headed toward the historic district. Mm-hmm. You end up on a signature street, and then we're going to be transitioning into the historic district. On either side of 161, what sort of treatment are we going to have in terms of walkways? And then have we thought about, right now there are striped medians, and I'm wondering if we would ever consider placing a treed median, because that's such a wide street. And I'm thinking about the main drag in North Carolina, Greenville, where there was the median, and these trees just kind of came over and created this beautiful shaded area. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking about how bright and sunny and hot that area is, and could we make it more appealing as we get more development along there. So how do we transition from this into our historic district? And is 161 going to be paved in that brick? Is that the envisionment? How will that work?
There's two levels of answer to that. One is that, in general, what we're doing is creating a typical tool palette that then we'd look very specifically at the conditions of what others, so if we're reconstructing 161 between the interchange improvements and the historic core, and we start to look at whether a tree line median is appropriate, we'd also be looking specifically at how these materials will fold it in. So one is kind of punting that question down the road, but more specifically, the way that we've set up this palette of materials, sorry to do this with you, but the brick that you see here, which is the slightly warmer brick, it's a little redder than the black brick. This is what we're currently proposing to be the sidewalks on the signature streets. It could also be, if we think it's appropriate, the street brick in the historic core. So as you transition from a signature street to the historic core, the sidewalk brick becomes the street brick. So you have a very close relationship, as well as the fact that the granite curb would be continuous along both. So there are some things that are threads throughout, and there are others that transition, but even those that transition, we want to keep in the same family.
And this brick here, you say is permeable.
All of the brick that you see here comes
One and
in
three.
an option
One
that's
through three.
permeable. It's a lug that gets put on it to assign that spacing.
A little what, I'm sorry?
It's a lug. It's a little bump on the edge that allows the water to go through. But it's the same color. It's the same look.
Is that any sort of cost difference, maintenance difference, longevity difference?
From permeable to
To-
just regular.
Yeah.
The only difference is that when the brick is in a street, it's thicker. So it's slightly more expensive. The sidewalk brick is not as thick.
I've got a question about the cost of John Shields Parkway. The original proposal, you're talking like 360 feet, or how many feet? Just for the initial phase?
It's, about 350, 360 feet, yeah.
So, and you're talking granite curbs and some of the materials that we talked about in there. So the bid that would go out would just be for the first 360 feet? So from a
That's correct.
cost-effective perspective, wouldn't it be better to do a bigger slice of the apple at one time as opposed to just 300 feet?
And we did talk about that, buying additional and stockpiling, but then there are the issues of where it's maintained. But we can look at.
Well, I'm just
if
posing the
that makes
question
some
because it doesn't
sense
seem like a
from
lot of,
timing.
that's basically a football field.
And that we did have some of those discussions, and it was a question that was raised. And so we are looking at that. I don't know if we'll be in a position to do that for this first phase of John Shields, but as we move forward and have additional projects that are coming online, then it is an option that we'll consider.
Okay, thank you.
And the reason that we can't do more than 360 is what?
I guess a couple of components. One is, if you look at the extension to the west, that will come down and intersect the new relocated Riverside Drive, which is being designed right now, and that interconnection will be a piece of that. You have grades, elevations, a lot of things. From a utility perspective, those have to connect. The next extension of this would be from Tuller Ridge East, would be the next piece. That really gets leveraged by the Casto project, and if the Casto project would move forward, the TIF that's contemplated builds the rest of that from Tuller Ridge all the way to Village Parkway. And you're aware of the buyer's acquisition that was completed. Conceivably, that project, if ultimately approved, would really be the major segment of this that would start to define the element there. This is more driven by a bit of an artificial time frame with the economic development agreement with Mr. Vrabel for the nursing home. Otherwise, we wouldn't be doing it in isolation like this. It's kind of forced some of the time frames to make some of these decisions quickly.
On the permeable paving, with the lug in it for the separation, allows the water penetration, what really keeps the weed growth and the maintenance down on that when you gap that like that?
What will happen over time is, one, the traffic of the vehicles will help. Two, what will happen is you won't get any growth coming from down below. It'll be as you get sediment and other things start trying to accumulate in there, you might have some bubbling up there. So there's going to be a little bit of a maintenance aspect. But generally speaking, the traffic is what's going to be the best tool to keep that in check.
Are the islands you're depicting, is this all under irrigation? Would they all be irrigated? No? Gonna have some hardy plants in there then, aren't you? I hope. Okay, thank you.
If I could follow up on Mayor Lee's question or concern with respect to the existing planters in historic Dublin. I thought that I'd suggested, not in this process, but to our staff previously, about something I've seen somewhere else. In Oakwood, Ohio, there's some railing that is used along Far Hills Avenue. It would be north of Dorothy Lane, and the actual speed limit in the area that I'm thinking of is 35 mile an hour. And, you know, the sidewalk is right there, you know. I mean, the only thing, I mean, there's curb and then there's street. And believe it or not, it seems to work. At least I think it works. I mean, in terms of, you know, giving a sense of safety, of security, whether in reality it would, you know, with a speeding car or 35 mile an hour. I don't know it would be more or less effective than the planners that we have. And I'm not suggesting that it would necessarily work, you know, where the planners presently exist, but I'm thinking maybe it would, maybe it wouldn't. That's for people that are far smarter regarding these matters than me. But maybe, you know, like along the, where the cemetery is and that sort of thing. But I just ask you to give it a look. You know, I think it's interesting. Amy, I don't know if you're familiar with.
Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. And driving through Oakwood, I don't know, maybe 6 months ago, I thought about Bridge Street, so that would be a good.
Yeah, that's all. Thank you.
I did not take a picture, I was driving.
Okay, thank you. There are a few other things that we want to present. That was sort of the main point of feedback, but a few other updates.
I'm glad we got away from the very high contrast, dark and light. That was not sitting well with me. I didn't have a better idea, but
Yeah.
this is nice.
Good, thank you. Marcia mentioned lighting. We are looking at proposing a standard light for the district. Currently, Dublin has 2 standard streetlight fixtures, which we would continue to use. What you see here in red are the multi-lane roads, 161 Riverside Drive. In blue, again, you see the historic core, and in yellow, this is the bulk of the streets within the Bridge Street district. So we would continue to use the standard CRE fixture on the roads that were in red. The wider roads require a taller fixture. It's about 30-plus feet high in order to get efficient light throw across those roads. This shows the fixture that's in the historic district. It's a Sternberg fixture. So those 2 fixtures would be used, again, respectively, the taller fixture on the red streets and the historic fixture in the historic core. And then we had presented for the balance of the streets a few options in our previous work session, working through several factors, including the aesthetics of the fixtures, their performance, their maintenance and operation. We've narrowed that down to 2. And you can see each of those in relationship to these fixtures. Because of the great transportation planning that's been done within the district, the fact that most of those yellow roads are 2-lane streets, we have the opportunity to use a lower, more pedestrian-friendly fixture. So you can see here we're closer to the height of the historic core fixture. These are some images of the 2. This is the Phillips Urbanscape, and this is a landscape forms fixture. And where we are in this process is we've narrowed this list down to 2, and we're meeting with the manufacturers. And we're getting samples of them and allowing staff and maintenance to pull them apart and look at them and ask a bunch of questions and make sure that we're getting something that's energy efficient, that's a high-quality fixture, that meets the safety and operational requirements of lighting a roadway and is beautiful. So that's a quick update where we are with the lighting. But before I move away from that, you know, also please weigh in if you have any thoughts of where we are in that process.
These are all LEDs, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Can we go back to where the Sternberg fixture would be utilized, on what streets?
It's the historic district fixture. So it's in the blue in the historic core.
Did we just switch those out?
Yeah, we did. They basically look the same, but we did switch them out to a more durable, and they're all LED lights now.
Gotcha. I'm wondering if that, I don't know, I guess I'm not a huge fan of the CRE fixture for this area. I mean, I wonder if there isn't something a little more aesthetically pleasing that we could use. They just seem to throw so much light, and I always wonder, you know, does it have to be this bright? You know, I I don't know, and maybe it does, you know, to be a pedestrian. I tend to like streets darker, but feel very safe in Dublin, so I guess, but I just wish we could do something a little nicer, a little, you know, maybe to differentiate this part of the city from, you know, the rest of the suburb. We've got, you know, I don't know how everybody else feels about that. You know, they certainly light up the street.
Darren, I think if I'm correct, I think these, at least for the landscape form fixture, they didn't have a counterpart of the same design that illuminated at a higher level. They had a different modern design. It was very attractive that, in fact, on this one landscape form, one of their big installations now, the city of Boulder, they have a different one that they use for a taller fixture. I don't know about Phillips, whether they have a counterpart that is taller or not. We're going to be meeting with them this week,
Right.
I believe.
They don't, I mean, you can certainly get ones in the same family that have some relationship, but they don't have something that's the same head, just, I mean, you could, the head would be underscaled, but I think we could explore an option to the Cree in the district.
I just think it'd be neat to have something different than what we have in the rest of the city.
Yeah.
Not necessarily something identical to that, but, you know, and I don't know how my colleagues feel about that, but I think it'd be kind of cool to differentiate it.
The only question that I would raise is that this will be a much higher density area with taller buildings and all. So we need to make sure there is sufficient lighting that people feel safe and don't allow for other people to feel they can jump in and move into people or something, you know.
Right.
So I'm not saying that what you're saying isn't true, but I think we do need to be conscious of the differential that will occur in that area.
Fairly, I appreciate what you're saying, and Amy, you as well. Amy, I think I had a similar initial reaction, you know, to this fixture, I guess because it suggests suburbia to me. And not necessarily in a negative way.
No, it's not
you know,
bad, it's
because
just-
but, you know, I guess we just asked the question, you know, do we want to somehow distinguish, you know, this district, you know, by utilizing a different, you know, head on it? I don't know. It's and Mary Lee raises a good question about, you know, the height of the buildings, you know, versus, you know, where these exist, you know, typically. I mean, they're in our office parks as well, I mean, of course, but there we've got setbacks, you know, large setbacks, and, you know, but otherwise they exist, you know, along roads near, you know, neighborhoods with, you know, rooftops that are 35 feet high.
There's been a lot of discussions with regard to what those illumination levels are, meeting the needs for both the roadway as well as the pedestrian walkways. I think you'll find that the lighting plans are something that both the engineering and the more kind of aesthetic-oriented considerations are very much aligned with regard to what those can do. I think we shared your concern with regard to a specialized fixture, particularly on Riverside Drive, which in all other ways will be very Bridge Street-like and kind of set a new tone to it. So we'd be happy to look at one or two of these alternatives. These are actually coming in as fairly cost-effective solutions, but we could look at some alternatives for you to consider there as well in terms of the taller fixtures.
So you'll bring some back for consideration then. Very good.
I'm not really against the Cree fixture, and I understand what you're trying to do, but I'm just curious, you know, OSU has those really great looking collars that are really distinguished that they have attached to light fixtures that really sort of hallmark and make the light fixture, you know, almost an object of art. And I'm just sort of curious what that costs to have those cast, and then, of course, they're screwed together with two clamps. Really a nice identifiable fixture that's
You mean the
upgrades
Buckeye
the
Club?
whole light fixture thing, and, you know, something with Dublin related to it. So I'm just sort of, while you're beating the guys up from Phillips and Landscape Forms, just sort of curious to find out what it costs to have those added to a light fixture.
Yeah,
John?
we can inquire.
John, are you talking about at the base how there's like sort of the sculptural Buckeye relief around it?
Right, yeah. And sometimes
Those are
they're
cool.
cast like in bronze or something to highlight they're the opposite color. They're a complementary color to the light fixture, which is black, and then
I've
also they
noticed
have
those
that collar
before.
around it that's done in sort of a brass. And, you know, ours could be God knows what, because it'd be
Shamrocks
50 million
and
people
leprechauns.
fighting over the design, but maybe it's shamrocks, who knows? But, you know, just,
Or
I'm just sort of curious what that costs, so, thank you.
Yes.
everywhere. You just, again.
The next piece is the cycle track. We are not revisiting the cycle track in terms of the general principles that initially established it. What we're finding as the design matures for the streets, as we start to move from preliminary design into final design on some of these streets, it's forcing us into some good thinking in terms of decisions with respect to exactly how the cycle track is configured. So as we've come across those decision points, we've reached back out to the Bicycle Advisory Task Force and certain members of that, brought them in, consulted with them to make sure that as we refine the streets, which have the cycle tracks associated with them, that we're making the decisions that are in the best practices out there in terms of how cycle tracks are developed. So this is not a change from a cycle track, this is a refinement as we move through the process. The colors, I apologize, are very difficult to distinguish here, but there is an internal loop that's John Shields Parkway, Village Parkway, comes down Park Avenue, Rock Crest, Shawn Falls, back up. This internal loop, maybe I'll use my laser here, represents the cycle track loop. And then the balance of this that is in purple is the bike path network. We've had a lot of discussions internally about what the difference between a bike path and a cycle track is, and there are some important distinctions. Our sense, as we work with the advisory task force and talk about it internally, is that for most users, the goal is to not have some sort of odd, abrupt transition, that it's going to be a seamless transition. I mean, you're talking about moving from an asphalt path to an asphalt path, but where it's located within the street envelope is what's the critical piece of the cycle track. This shows the loop I mentioned before that's largely John Shields Parkway, Village Parkway, Park, Shawn, and Rock Crest. And within that, the predominant typical arrangement of the cycle track is shown here in green. Because we have the Indian Run Park here, and because we have the Greenway along John Shields, potentially a little bit of space here as you move north of Wendy's, we have the opportunity to put a two-way cycle track adjacent to that green. So if you recall from going through the DVC process, there was a lot of discussion about how someone who parks on the street navigates the cycle track to get across to where they want to shop. That's really not an operative dimension for the majority of this loop where the cycle track is against the green. So it's a great relationship, and we've vetted this pretty thoroughly with the advisory task force, and they think that's a fantastic arrangement. The one exception to that is what's currently being proposed by Crawford Hoying. It's a 2-block stretch of Park Avenue from Riverside Drive to Tuller, and that is the core of their retail and mixed-use district. And so what we have there, instead of a cycle track on one side of the street, it's split between both sides of the street. And I'll show you some examples here of how we're approaching that. But just for clarity, the only difference between the green and the orange here is just a little bit in terms of how the cycle track and the sidewalk are differentiated. So this is an example of the relationship between the cycle track and the sidewalk that you would see, in the green area here, and also in this blue area, where the difference is delineated by paving materials. And there is no vertical grade break between the two. On Riverside Drive, we have a condition where we have a landscape buffer that separates the cycle track from the sidewalk. As we worked through with the advisory task force and staff and worked through this issue, the advantages of what you see here on the left, where the sidewalk and the cycle track are flush and adjacent but separated by materials, the advantage is, one, in some areas we have limited right-of-way. We have some areas like that 2-block stretch of Park Avenue where Crawford Hoying is proposing their retail mixed-use district, where we anticipate times of very heavy pedestrian use. There's also going to be times on a Tuesday morning where they may not be huge shopping crowds. But when you have these flush and adjacent to each other, it gives you the flexibility to have occasionally a cyclist pass into the sidewalk area when safety and common sense allows you to do that. And you allow the pedestrians to sometimes encroach into the cycle track area on a very heavy shopping day, and the cyclist needs to be aware. And these are common sense things. We've spent years moving away from auto malls in downtown districts where we thought we had to separate all modes of traffic, and we're starting to bring cars and people back together. And I think sometimes in our zeal to create the safest cycle route, we're separating these modes in ways that really may not have that many inherent liabilities. And we've been very careful to reach out and make sure that this isn't some internal proclivity of ours, that we're working with the Bike Advisory Task Force and making sure that they're endorsing this, and they believe that this is a good direction to go. But I know it's a little bit of a change from some of the initial thinking in terms of how this was arranged, so be happy to talk about that in depth if you'd like.
On the, when we get down to the major shopping area, I'm sort of interested in, okay, we have the pedestrian track and then we have the cycle track. And I think what I'm very interested in knowing is, is there enough expanse of hard surface that these different entrepreneurs and restaurants and whatever's down there can have enough space to come out onto the sidewalk to make it a more interesting experience, and maybe outdoor dining and other things, or, temporary things, exhibits and clothes racks or whatever or, appropriate signage for whatever the special is of the day. So is there enough room spatially for that to happen and still these other two traffic modes to occur?
It's limited in the right-of-way. I think the code has envisioned that those type of activities that are those private uses would take place within a building envelope that gets pushed back from the right-of-way. So we'd have outdoor dining or retail displays. The goal is to have that behind the right-of-way line.
Okay. I just want to keep that in mind so that that doesn't get infringed on, because I think it's one of the more interesting and nicer aspects of this kind of development.
Yeah, absolutely.
To follow up with John on that, one option that I see, and even Georgetown area does this too, but is when they don't necessarily have a lot of room to put tables out there, that they have the glass windows like Rusty Bucket does that opens up. Mm-hmm. So I would encourage that when we're working with retailers, that we encourage them to use that concept too, mm-hmm. Which I don't know of anybody in Dublin but Rusty Bucket that's doing that, but I think I've seen it in a lot of cities, and I think a lot of times it's because they don't have a lot of space, but you get a feel like you're outside.
Yeah. Okay. Other comments on the cycle track? Okay.
Roll on.
The last piece is the John Shields Parkway. This is the east-west street that eventually is envisioned to have a vehicular bridge connection across the Sauter River that would pass through and connect to OCLC and back down to 161. The planning foundation for this is a greenway that runs along the south side of this street on the east side of the river. And part of what we've been charged to do is look at this from the standpoint of the development proposals that are starting to come in. So even though we're not looking for any specific action on this, as the Casto development proposal matures and comes back in front of you, we need to better understand how the green portion of that street corridor addresses that development and how they engage it. We want to show you some initial thoughts on that. This is a map. Again, the dark blue or gray is the loop that we've mentioned before. One of the observations that we've made as we move through this process is that this loop, the planning that went into the idea of the cycle track and this loop in here has incredible value for the district. We've talked before, you see the two circles here. This is a 10-minute walk from the historic core and the river. This is a 20-minute walk out here. It's an east-west oriented district, and when we talk about walkable district, we really want to be able to move people safely and comfortably from the perimeter of this area and from outlying areas to the core amenities, to the historic core and to the riverfront. And this loop plays a very valuable role in doing that, and the green along here is a great asset in terms of making that an enjoyable move to the historic core. We have a couple of principles that we're using to approach this. I'll give the quick same caveat that I did when we looked at the streetscape renderings. Again, this architecture is not specific to any development proposal. It's to give you the sense of what we're trying to create along this green here. So in this view, we're floating above Village Parkway and we're looking west towards the river. And one of the first key considerations that we want to look at with this project is framing the edges. It's absolutely critical that this green, as well as the street, have an urban architectural edge for a number of reasons. Having maybe the least of which, but not unimportant, is the surveillance that you get from having active edges on public green space so that it feels safe and legitimate to be out there, having the activity to see on those spaces, having architecture that aggressively fronts that green space in terms of having porches and stoops and front doors and things that open out on that green space. That's all part of making this a good, legitimate, enjoyable movement for a pedestrian or a cyclist, well, and a motorist for that matter, along this corridor. And as we start to look at specific dimensions and go through development proposal process, we're looking everywhere we can to try and create as much continuity to that street wall as possible. This is an example of how that could play out. Again, John Shields Parkway is off to the view on the right. You see just a little bit of the cycle track here, which is adjacent to the green. Moving into the green, side street that's not visible off to the left. And again, you can see how having some architecture framing this really creates a fantastic space. The second important principle is creating a public way. In order for this green not to feel like one big front yard for the architecture that we're proposing that fronts it, we want to have a public way along here. That's not likely to be a street or an alley that's going to carry vehicular traffic, but it needs to be a generous, well-defined, well-lit, not overlit, way for the public to move along there so that you see that edge. And again, this is an example here where you can see the public way along here. There's also a lot of value to that in terms of having some redundancy in terms of how you walk and move through the space, so you're not forced to walk only on the sidewalk. This is the way that you get into and engage the park. The next principle is anchoring the experience. So when you look at the far eastern end and the far western end, you've got the opportunity to have a great head of the park experience. And that could be anything from cafes that open out onto the green, public art, but some way to really anchor this so that you draw people through visually and experientially moving through that linear green space. The other thing that we're looking at, this circle right here, and I don't have any illustrations to show this, but this is an important thought. As we've started to look at what Casto is bringing forward or future development proposals that are being looked at as part of this, we want to make sure that we leverage the best possible use for the community out of the public open space dedication that's required as part of their development. So when we look at the John Shields Green, we look at the future dog park that the Parks Director and his staff are starting to think through in terms of having that amenity located somewhere along here to serve the growing residential population. And we have the green itself. We've got these three different pieces. We've got a public open space dedication for private development. We've got the 60-foot wide John Shields Green. We've got a dog park. We want to make sure that these aren't just happening where they're expedient for various reasons, that they're thought of together. So as we start to look at this, we look at where matured vegetation exists out there now. We look at the geographic relationship between the edges of the district. There's an experience that likely happens somewhere midstream along this 3,500 linear foot green that's in the center there that varies a little bit from your typical experience that we've been showing you along here. So that's a long-winded explanation of what this middle circle represents. And then the last thought here is how we engage the streets. Where the streets intersect this parkway is the primary threshold for the public into these parks. And you see in this example here, this is John Shields Parkway. This is an intersecting side street. You can see the green here. The thought is that we want to have continuous sidewalk on the side street, continuous sidewalk on John Shields. You can see the cycle track here, which is proposed to be asphalt. Then this is an option that we're exploring for how to engage the park, where we want to make sure we recognize things as simple as the fact that, from campus or any other example, people will cut a line that's most convenient to them, a cow path. So we want to make sure that we can bring people from the corners into the park in a way that doesn't force them to march in a 90-degree angle here. And that residual creates a really great opportunity to have some thresholds here, whether it's floral or horticultural, that we'll have to look carefully at our maintenance requirements and what that means. in terms of offering some seating opportunities as you're walking from, let's say, near Sawmill down to the river. There's going to be a few places where you want to stop and rest and be able to relax and have some shade and enjoy. So these are some great opportunities to do that. And then as you move into the sort of typical center section of this, it's more traditional open green with limbed up trees and the public ways. So that's the conclusion of our material. Any thoughts on the progress on the Greenway?
I'm thinking these would also be really interesting places to locate public art. And maybe, water features here and there, because that's really pleasant if you can sit and relax and there's water or art or something interesting. And it also, if you have visitors, you can have, art tours where they're walking, and it brings them, through the district, and they'll probably eat lunch or, shop or whatever. So I think this is exciting. I'm glad. Keep talking about public green, and every single thing that we've seen up until tonight just shows this flat green field. And so I'm thinking, just grass. Come on, we got to do more. So this is good.
Thank you.
I just think it's a good concept, and you used all the major features of a good planning class and updated them to modernity. I think you did a really nice job with that, and I think if this is executed with this kind of concept and with good architecture, if you build it, I think they're going to come. Because this is really going to be nice spaces. And you did a lot of good thought and preparation for this. Are you a landscape architect?
What's that?
Are you a landscape architect?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
It occurred to me how lucky we are as a city to be where we are to financially to make these kinds of selections, because there aren't too many suburbs that have this ability. So
I'm also, go ahead.
I assume that we'll incorporate some sort of seating, benches, whatever, within these areas?
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
And the other thing that was interesting is I didn't realize it was such a 20-minute walking period to get from the one end down to the urban core where the restaurants are going to be. So I can see why the cycle part of this is really important, and that we also prepare places for people to put their cycles, store their cycles while they're conducting their affairs or exercising, whatever they're doing. So it's going to be an integral part of all this. Thank you.
Great. Well, I think our main takeaway from this that we need right away is the fact that we're ready to move forward with the palette of the materials that were presented this evening and for the bid that we'll bring back to you in July 1. And as far as the other items, we'll continue to work on those and bring options back as we move forward. The next item is the development review process, and there was a rather lengthy memo that was put together, and Steve's going to briefly go through the key points that are in that for council's discussion.
very good. Mr. Langworthy?
Good evening, Mayor, members of council. She would mention that it's lengthy. That's the thing I'm most embarrassed about, is that length, but I'm not known for writing those long memos, but so I apologize for that. I'm going to briefly summarize that so you can get into your discussion as quickly as possible. In summary, we have three areas that we've asked you to look at. One has to do with the creation of the neighborhood district that we proposed, Riverside Neighborhood District, and sort of its relationship and differences related to how planned unit developments might interact with those. Also, there's been some information requested about the jurisdiction issues related to the Bridge Street District projects in the Historic District and the Architecture Review Board's jurisdiction there, so we'll highlight those briefly as well. You recall, I know you'll recall, that when we first started this process, particularly in the zoning process, there were two things we were trying to emphasize. One was we needed a code and a regulation that would create the kind of environment we were looking for, that urban kind of environment that we were wishing for. So we did that, and we used that to kind of form the bones and the framework. And as well as how the buildings relate to that framework throughout the district. That was through the code. Another part of the code and the process had to do with how we would relate that necessarily to what we used to be doing in Plainview development districts. For the most part, when we use Plainview developments, those are in more greenfield areas and more isolated. Except, I would say, probably back in the 80s when we had some really, really large PUDs. Even those were kind of developed in isolated pockets. They weren't necessarily connected one to the other in all circumstances. So that became kind of legacy of PUDs, was allow us kind of that flexibility, but it also didn't allow us to frame much of a framework and relationship from one development to the other. The second aspect of this was fostering consistency in our decision-making, predictability in our decision-making, and timeliness was also an effort we wanted to do. We first wanted to have any applicant or developer to have a clear expectation of what the city wanted particularly in terms of quality. We did that because we wanted them to be able to base both their financial and their development considerations on that, knowing what those regulations were going to be, and also having some assurance of a timely review process. I've worked for, with, and in some cases against developers for a long time, but one of the consistent messages I typically hear from them, and still do today, is I'll build what you want, I just want you to tell me what I have to build, and don't make me use a year to find out what you want. So that was one of the purposes of creating the regulations the way we did, was to make sure that predictability was in place. Of course, the PUD process does have some advantages from the city. First of all, it would remove the mandatory review times that are in the codes and remove some of the action limitations that are there. One of the action limitations, for example, is there's no ability to change a portion of the code. If a developer comes in meeting the code, then they're entitled to have that option. They can't meet the code, and it can't be changed away from meeting the code. The other advantage, of course, also had to do with the amount of discretion that would be allowed through a PUD process would be an advantage as well. Of course, these offset sometimes from, in developers' eye at least, by that increased uncertainty and the lack of timely decision-making that sometimes occurs. More specifically then, when we were forming the code, the consultants we had recommended that we look at some areas that we knew we had some uniformity of development potential. There were two in particular. One was OCLC. You recall OCLC came in early in the process, actually I think even before this process started, and began to think about how they might develop their campus, unlike the past when their campus was pretty well closed off and they had no development interest there. So they began development of at least kind of a sketch master plan. The other area that the consultants had us look at was the Dublin Village Center, mainly because of its size and the fact that it had essentially one property owner involved at the time. Now, the reason we wanted to create these is because we wanted to create them, and you'll recall Dave Dixon used to talk to us about the capital P places, the big places that we wanted to create, and allowing us to have that size of property and the cohesiveness of individual regulations that will apply to those allowed us to create, so I think, some very interesting places, capital Ps. So we created then the Indian Run and the Sawmill Center neighborhoods, and those are the two neighborhoods that we created that have basically, you still follow the code in most circumstances. There's some things that are particular to their geographic areas and their circumstances and their master planning that are particular to them. This is possible largely because, for the most part, property owners were cooperative with us. They saw the potential for being able to create these neighborhoods and went along with us in doing it at the time. Now, in the corridor area in particular, I'll highlight it there. In the corridor area in particular, at the time, you might recall when we're going through the rezoning process and phase, We had a number of different property owners that were present in this river corridor area, the area that's highlighted there in the, I'll hesitate to call it pink, but I guess pinkish area. At the time, those property owners weren't particularly interested in cooperating with us in creating a unified development. They each had kind of their own ideas about what they wanted to do. Some wanted just to preserve what they had in place. Some wanted just to make sure that recently approved projects weren't changed. So there wasn't a cooperation between those property owners at the time. Since then, of course, things have changed pretty dramatically, with Crawford Horning now gathering these projects, assembling these lands together, as well as the city's strategic acquisitions that we made as well, and the infrastructure improvements, has created the opportunity, similar to what we had in Indian Run, similar to what we had in Sawmill Center, to create, again, one of these neighborhoods where we have a unified development that can be treated under their own circumstances, unified development for the area. Ironically, had we had this condition then, we probably would have recommended a neighborhood for this. Had we had cooperating property owners, or single property owners in particular, we likely would have created a neighborhood at that time. So so instead of having three different zoning districts that were in place, we did decide to create these the Riverside Neighborhood District. One thing that's important to remember, the review process does not change. There's nothing in the Riverside Neighborhood regulations that change the process from having a development plan, site plan, and basic plan all reviewed by the Planning and Zoning Commission. That stays the same. Also, even if we had a PUD, and there has been raised the idea of could a PUD be established in this area as well, and that certainly could be the case. But even if it was, I'm sure we would want to have as many of the elements of the Bridge Street District encompassed in that PUD as we possibly could, even if it was under a PUD. So the criteria that we've been using for the Riverside neighborhood zoning, again, had to do with unified property owner, unified development, and ability to have kind of a master plan put in place. Honestly, to date, we haven't had any applications for a PUD to date. The only rezoning, in fact, we've had in the district has been the Wendy's, when we took that actually out of Bridge Street and put it into a community commercial district for Wendy's. We do see, though, that there could be an advantage for PUD, that the applicant would then have the ability to kind of rewrite the form-based code specific to their property, or in some cases they may default to the existing code. The biggest differences for us, as I mentioned earlier, would be taking away the mandatory review time frames, and it would give the applicant the potential for avoiding the more prescriptive urban design standards that we have in the code. Again, we would request any PUD that was submitted, we would want them to comply as much as possible to the Bridge Street regulations. But overall, we've been following, at staff level, we've been following what we believe to be your direction to stay with the Bridge Street District regulations, the zoning districts and regulations. That's been our emphasis in emphasizing what the council's direction has been to us throughout this process. So we're recommending that the city continue its review of the proposed Riverside Neighborhood Amendment rezoning, and it not be considered in lieu of any other potential development review process. The last subject had to do with historic district reviews. When the code was being put together, the council was very specific to us that we not take away any of the review authorities of the ARB. The ARB process essentially remain intact. That means that still any projects that fall within the ARB boundaries then still fall within their jurisdiction. Another, I think, useful aspect that you asked us to put in the code was the ability to draw on outside consultants if we needed them to help us. To date, we've been doing that pretty actively, particularly for the administrative review team in developing its recommendations to both the Planning Commission and the Architecture Review Board. And we've retained a number of consultants to do that for us. Overall, the ARB has been engaged in the plan review process or in the zoning review process throughout this, and so they've been using the code pretty consistently. I think they have a pretty good knowledge of the code as it's applied. And even when the code was being developed, they provided recommendations to us for changes in the code that we provided back as a recommendation to the Planning and Zoning Commission. So given how that how new the regulations are, and the fact we really haven't had a chance to vet any large projects, I think we really only had one large project that's been approved. That's the Edwards Apartment project. To date, we're not recommending that any jurisdictional changes or review changes be made at this time. So overall, staff is recommending 3 policy issues or recommendations. First, the council affirm the policy that preferred zoning and development review process is the Bridge Street District zoning regulations, but the PUDs may continue to be an option for an applicant to request in some limited cases. As I mentioned, PUDs can still be requested by an applicant. There's nothing to prohibit that in the code right now. Secondly, that the Planning and Zoning Commission be requested to continue its review of the Riverside Neighborhood Zoning District amendment and area rezoning separate from discussion of other zoning policies, and submit its recommendation for proposed neighborhood district to City Council for final action. And finally, that there be no change in reviewing authorities established by the adopted Bridge Street District zoning regulations. I hope that was briefer than reading 7 pages, but.
Thank you. Discussion?
I'm in agreement with your recommendations. First of all, I don't know, I wrote in myself a note, what is different today than what we approved 2 or 3 years ago in terms of the primary reasons that we wanted to develop the codes to begin with? And I don't think anything has changed. We still have an interest in having predictability and timeliness. So I don't see a reason for my vote to change. Also, we have no history yet. So you know, I don't know why we would change something when we don't even know that that there's a problem with it. And I've read read all the ART minutes on a regular basis, and it seems as though there's dialogue, a significant dialogue with the developer and with the standards that are currently in place. So I think that we felt very strongly at the time that this area of the city was to be different. It was to look different, it was to have different standards, different codes, and it was to have a process that was different because we wanted to attract a different kind of builder, for one thing, and the product at the end would be different. So that's, you know, at this point, I don't have any reason to change my vote.
If I may.
Please.
I agree with virtually everything that Mayor Lee stated. I think we should stay true to our vision and the framework that was established. You know, acknowledging, you know, that this is new. And at the outset, we understood that it may need to be tweaked along the way. And in fact, we've tweaked it already. You know, allowing for the Planning and Zoning Commission greater input than the code allowed initially. You know, I think that was a pretty significant change that we made, or amendment that we made. And that's not to say that there will not be revisions to the code that we deem necessary, you know, as time goes on. We're very early in this process. So anyway, enough said. Thank you.
John?
No, you know, I think it's all been said, really, and I agree with 1, 2, and 3. So I think both Marilee and Tim have stated the obvious. Thank you.
I wanted to ask a question, if I could. Steve, you talked about hiring consultants for architectural matters, and I'm curious if that is strictly for the ART and sort of so you can give recommendations to applicants, and then pass that along to our boards and commissions? Or how do those architects, or do they interact with the boards and the commissions?
First of all, we've used them for virtually every review. We even went out and got a specific consultant for signs, a graphic consultant for signs. So we're trying to cover a broad range of areas. So we use some outside assistance for virtually every project to get that extra view or outside view. That then information is included both in our recommendation, but we also include the full report with that material so that whoever, whether it's ART or ARB or Planning and Zoning Commission for that matter, can see what the other opinions were on that. So everybody gets to see everything.
Okay. And then with regard to the ARB, in the past, it seems the ARB typically is very, very detail focused on individual buildings, and they are looking at historic buildings and making sure that those historic buildings are true with regard to things as minute as the plate where the numbers will go on the building, or the design of the font on those numbers, the color of the shutters, the color of the trim, the roof shingle between, shingle A or B, and I would look at it and go, it's a gray shingle, and they'd say, no, it's a whatever shingle it is. So it's very, very detail focused, has been, sort of their charge until now. And you had said that you believe that they are up to the task of doing the overlay, the bigger project, several blocks worth of development, both those details that make our historic district, but additionally all the other things like the street network, parking ratios, all the different things that typically are seen at P&Z. And I just want to, for everybody in the room, hear your assurances that ARB either has the training or they will have the training that they need, or you think they're ready now, and obviously I've not talked to anybody on ARB about, what they have or haven't been experienced with, or what you've done with them in terms of training or exposure. But I wanted to know, what your thoughts are on their abilities and their capacity for these larger developments that we're going to see come in the historic district.
Yeah, I'm confident they'll have the ability to do it. The advantage we have is the ARB goes through the same kind of review process that every other project does, and they have the basic plan review, which gives them the ability to see a kind of a larger view of things. But as you mentioned, the site plan review that's required from most other projects also goes into that level of detail where we talk about shutters, and we talk about fixtures, and we talk about colors, and we talk about materials, and all of those things are talked about even outside the historic districts, not just in the historic district. So obviously they're probably going to be very attuned to that aspect of it, but they also have the advantage of seeing that larger view, or getting that larger view through the basic plan process as well. And again, they don't do this on their own. None of the boards we work with do this on their own. We provide assistance to them in whatever capacities that they feel are necessary, or we feel are necessary,
Okay.
or desirable.
All right. Thank you. I appreciate that very much.
Anybody else? I had one quick question, and I don't have the experience all of you have, but PUDs in some limited cases to be permitted, what is that? How would that be? What's limited, and who decides?
I mentioned there in one circumstance, for example, where a PUD might be. I don't think necessarily desirable, but could be used, is where we don't have to worry too much about where the street networks are, and maybe it's more isolated from some of the other areas so we don't have to worry too much about relationships, or maybe some isolated pockets and areas where a PUD might be able to be used. I could think, for example, if you think of the properties by the vet clinic in there, that's an area that's kind of isolated that we can get enough of the development regulation to get them up to the street and do all the other things we kind of want, but they could do it under a PUD process if they wanted to.
Okay. Anybody else?
Yeah, I agree with the comments that have been made. It's probably a little too early to be changing the rules of the game, so to speak, at this point. But I would also expect that we would continue as a staff, P&Z and council to, continue to monitor these rules and these codes and to improve as time goes on, which I'm sure we'll all do. The one question, Steve, that I had, there was something brought to our attention by way of an email with respect to ARB, I think a couple weeks ago, that they were looking over a project over on High Street. And it wasn't clear to me, but it looked like they were, and I think this gets more to what maybe Amy's talking about. They have been they're a very good body. They've been very detail-oriented in the past, consistent with their charge. Now we are asking them to become more visionaries, if you will, something that's consistent with this Bridge Street corridor and the like. And I thought I saw where they were doing some garage doors on High Street. And was that, or so that would be a good idea with respect to the condos over there on Bridge Street?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear what your question was.
Well, I don't have the question yet. I just want to know first, did I read that email properly, that ARB was approving some garage doors that would be facing Bridge Street? Or I'm sorry, High Street.
Are you speaking of Crawford Hoyne gave a presentation at their very last meeting of similar to the presentation that you all got about the Bridge Park development, but just particularly for the historic district. And part of that, for that western side, showed the main garage entrance on South High Street.
Okay.
Excuse me, North High Street.
North High Street.
Yeah, so that was just part of their proposal that was shown to council as well. So there was some discussion and concerns about, is that treated appropriately? But it was just a presentation to get them up to speed of, here's what the overall vision is of this Bridge
So
Park.
that's not something the ARB said, yeah, that's fine?
No, it was just, these are things to consider in the project proposal and looking at that, the scale of that at North High Street, then also what's on the riverside as well. So they were just that informal presentation that was given to council at your work session.
Okay, well, I'm not suggesting we change things today, but what I would like to point out that, it strikes me that possibly having garage doors on North High Street might be inconsistent with, walkability, traffic, things like that.
Right.
And I would really hope that staff would point those things out to a developer such as Crawford Hoyne.
Yeah.
And help rather recommend to ARB that, hey, look, this is not consistent with the vision plan and so forth. Because although there is discretionary challenges of ARB to council, for appeals rather, that's if the developer doesn't like the decision of ARB.
Right.
Now, the converse of that would be is the developer says, well, gee, I like what ARB did. Well, what's our remedy if it's not consistent with that vision? So I would just caution everybody that I think that's still, to me, that's still a sore point. And I would like for us to look at that a little bit more. And maybe it's just more a function of being more vigilant on staff, being more vigilant with ARB, that sort of thing. But I think we need to keep an eye on that.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, at that meeting, they were presented those materials at their table. They weren't provided those ahead of time, so they were providing comments on the fly, and there's been no formal application, so we would look at that as part of that.
And the only other observation was that, when Castle brought their apartments to us, they kept saying, well, this meets your code. Well, there's 7 people up here that said, well, we don't like it. So, I don't know how we square that, but maybe that's just the growing pains of all of this,
I think that was the applicant's interpretation of meeting your code. Staff didn't believe it and you didn't believe it.
Well, yeah, I suspect that, but yeah, I mean, I agree with what Mary Lee, when she started this out, I mean, changing horses right now just doesn't seem to be wise. We have a lot of things to correct, but I think we're on board.
Thank you.
Well, it looks like we've got the consistency of opinion here, and I would agree with what's been said as well. Greg, I don't know if you want to weigh in, but...
a lot of this started well before me, Mayor, but it seems to be going in the direction it needs to go.
So is that the direction you need tonight, then so be it. Okay, and is there anything further? We have outcomes, next steps. you've been given direction on the streetscapes and the materials, et cetera, so, and you know you're coming back to us with some lighting fixtures, alternatives to the Cree. Okay?
And we'll continue to look at issues as it relates to bridge, or to the historic district and the different elements involved in the historic district.
Agreed. So,
Do
will
we
that
have-
conclude our business tonight?
One thing, do we have a work session 2 weeks from this evening, June 16th?
Do we have a topic scheduled yet? We currently don't have a topic that we have scheduled, so right now it's open.
Okay, I didn't want to propose one, I just wondered if we were scheduled.
Yeah, I think after we get through tonight, everything that we need so far, we're okay. So
Okay.
if there's
do
any
you wanna
additional
bring up the-
update, we'll let you know.
Planning and zoning? We were going to have a meeting on that. Should that be
That's
this,
the 24th.
the 24th?
I was going to call Ann and just let her know. Ann, we are scheduled for the 24th to have a work session with respect to, or admin committee meeting, rather, I'm sorry.
On chart.
With respect to the charter review.
Right.
We would also at that time like to, we're going to discuss some personnel matters with respect to board and commissions.
And what time is that scheduled for?
I think we're on for 6, aren't we not?
Everybody okay with that time then? Very good.
So we'll start with the 1, then we'll move into the, and I'll get with, Marcia and I talked about a week and a half ago that we were going to kind of collaborate on an agenda with respect to the charter review, and if anybody has any comments, please give me a call, text, email, what have you, throw those on the agenda as well.
Okay. Anything else? We'll stand adjourned. Thank you.